They did. Okay, I believe I'm ready. Moishe, buenos días. Antes que empiece la grabación, ¿cómo estuvo anoche? Excelente. Excitement. Hablamos. Hazaku Baruch. I'm ready. Good morning, Kahel Kadosh. Beruchim Abayim to everybody. Today, Friday, the first day of December, corresponding to the 18th day of Mar Heshvan, 5784. Erev Shabbat Kodesh, Perashat Ba'ishlach, Makam Siga. Today's class, graciously sponsored by Miss Marcel Zaid and Mr. Clement Sofer, Le'ilui Nishmat, their beloved father, Yosef Sofer ben Simcha, and her mother-in-law, Esther Zaytune Bat Jamile. Iratzon, that to the words of Torah, their neshamot rather, have aliyah in Gan Eden. Amen. Additionally, today's class, graciously sponsored by the Sasson and Bihar family upon the recent wedding of their children, Ro'i and Sharon, may they build a Beit Ne'eman Israel, and Refuah Shelema for Yoyada, Yada Kasava Kohen ben Faride, Eliyahu ben Simcha, Hayal, Shimon Pinhas ben Rivka, Zera Shekayama, Tamar Rachel, Bat Hana, and obviously for continuous good news coming from Eretz Israel. Baruch Hashem, we are following some of the news that there seems to be more releasing of hostages, and Be'ezat Hashem, may they all be reunited with their respective families. May the soldiers be protected. May all the Holim and the Pesuim, the wounded, have a refuah shelema. HaKadosh Baruch Hu income damam of those that regretfully gave their life or lost their lives through the current events in Eretz Israel. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam she'akol nihiya bidbaro. Thank you so much. Thank you. So as we do on Fridays, excuse me, we'll discuss perhaps just a couple of pointers of this week's parasha that we have been touching very superficially this past week, discussing the encounter again of Yaakov and Esav. One of the basic formulas in the relationship between Yaakov and Esav, it is not only the encounter discussed in Parasha Ba'ishlach, but actually when we discussed a few weeks ago in Parasha Toledot. The pasuk there says, Hakol kol Yaakov be'ayadayim yadei Esav. Everybody knows this pasuk. The Torah is giving us the ideal formula for Am Israel. And the Torah says, as long as the voice of Yaakov, meaning to say, the voice of Torah, the voice of Tefillah, the voice of Tehillim, etc., is in a strong way, then the hands of Esav, the violence, so to speak, of Esav, to a certain extent, gets weakened. Now, if everybody remembers the famous statement by the great Gaon of Vilna that he quotes, and it says, that is true. But that pasuk also tells us why often Esav has the upper hand. And he explains that if you look in the Sefer Torah, the way the word is written, and maybe for the benefit of our audience, allow me to write this very quickly, so this way the Kahal understands what the Gaon of Vilna is saying. So the way we read it in the Sefer Torah, it's known, Hakol Kol Yaakov. But the Gaon of Vilna says, true. But look at what's happening in the first word. The second word has a vav. But this word does not have a vav. So how can I read this word? It says Hakal. Hakal Kol Yaakov. If the voice of Yaakov is weak, then Yadayim Yede Esav, the hands of Esav can become activated. So true, our strength comes from this pasuk, but our weakness also comes from this pasuk. This is the foundation of the great pirush that we're going to say now. And the pasuk writes as follows. It says that Yaakov Avinu, alav shalom, acted in a way throughout his life to keep the sound of Torah alive and well. We have seen it not only when Yaakov Avinu lived with Ishak and Rivka, his parents, not only when after that, for those that were here last Friday, and we ask, why was there a need for Yaakov Avinu after 67 years, I believe, of learning Torah with his father, to go and learn another 14 years in the Kolel of the Yeshiva of Shem Ba'ever. So we explains that there are two different types of Torah learning. One Torah learning was to understand and to absorb and to have knowledge of Torah. That was the Torah learned with Ishak. In Shem Ba'ever, what type of Torah did he learn? The Torah to learn how to survive when your environment is problematic. And Yaakov Avinu knew this. He was moving to the house of his father-in-law, the house of Lavan, that was a problematic person to begin with. So who are you going to ask an advice from? From someone that also went through challenges. Shem, the son of Noah, he lived prior to the Mabul, saw the decadence of the world. Then he spent time with his family building the Teva. Then he lived through the Mabul. Then he lived after the Mabul. So guess what? Shem, in this case, fulfills the Mishnah that says, En hacham keba'al nisayon. There is no wiser person than a person that has experience. And I mentioned this other in this morning class of one of the ladies' classes earlier in the week. You cannot ask for Shalom Bayit advice to someone that is single. You cannot ask education of children to someone that was never a parent. So who are you going to go? You're going to go to the one that has wisdom in this particular field. You're not going to go to a dermatologist if you need to have an eye exam. You're not going to go to the podiatrist if you need to go to do a cleanup for your mouth. You understand what I'm trying to say? So who are you going to go to? To Shem. And after that, Yaakov Avinu had enough battery charged, and that was one of the astonishments of Esav. Esav, when he encountered Yaakov Avinu, Esav doesn't really understand. And I'm skipping the beginning of the Pesukim because we'll discuss them very another Shabbat afternoon here. But look quickly what happens with Yaakov Avinu. The Pasuk writes, I'm trying to find the Pasuk to give you the proper verse. So this way we don't make any mistake in quoting the Pesukim of the Perashah. And I'm using a Hokle Israel, so every Pasuk is 4 pages almost. Okay, right there. Ba'isa'it einav, Esav lifts up his eyes, and he sees the wives and the children. Bayomer, mi elelach, who are these? Now, the basic question is, on the surface, that Esav wanted to know what was the relationship between these. Are they your wife and children? Or maybe they are slaves. In those days, owning slaves, having slaves, it was common. And that the children born to the slaves became the property, so to speak, of their master, it was common. This is the basic question. You know what was the real question that Esav is asking Yaakov? How were you able to have your children following in your footsteps when your environment was adverse to your principles. Can you relate to that? It's like you want to remain Torah observant and connected to Judaism, but you live in a city that there is no minyan, and there is no synagogue, and there is no rabbi, and there is no Torah classes. You cannot survive. Even though you say, I connect through Zoom, that's not really connecting. That's connecting to a certain extent. You need to have the human interaction. That's why the halacha is that in the event that you, and we heard this the other day in one of the minyanim, what happens when a hostage or a soldier came back from war? Do you have to say the beracha when you see him, or no? Shehiyat metim or shehiyano, more appropriate. Okay? Even though you saw him via video, you still have to recite the beracha when you see him face to face, because seeing someone via video, maybe it keeps the spirit alive, but it's not the same like the human touch, human interaction. I think we all agree to that. And that was actually the question of Esav. I thought, Esav says, that spending 20 years in the house of Lavan, you would have been my partner in crime. Because this is what Esav understood. Esav says, you go with the flow. And this is how Esav live. Our Torah, it tells you, yeah, go with the flow, right? But only when the flow is good. So what Yaakov Avinu says, Vayomar, and it says, Hayeladim asher hanan Elokim et avdecha. Thank you so much. You got to look on the doorpost of the synagogue. Thank you so much. And it says, the children that God engraced me with. And that's the gave me basically. And that's the reason why, if we go back to one pasuk, which I want to say right in the beginning of the parasha, listen to the following question. Okay? Now, Esav wants to get rid of Yaakov. We all know that, right? And then, what do? Let's say we are Yaakov, and the pasuk writes, listen to the pasuk, Vayhili, right here, in the beginning, it says, I have an ox, I have a donkey, I have sheep, I have a slave, I have a maid servant, a female slave. This is what Yaakov says. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 items. Yaakov says it to Esav. And Rashi asks one question. I don't understand. You only have one donkey? You only have one ox? You only have one slave? Rashi says that Yaakov Avinu is saying, I have flocks, I have animals. That's all. But the Torah uses a singular language for one of these items. But to many, the pasuk should have been more specific. So Rashi answers that sometimes this is the way people speak. But I'm going to tell you what I saw in the Divrei Mordechai. I think a Sefer written by Hacham Mordechai Eliyahu Alav Shalom. And I'm going to write the name of these animals because each one of these names represents something else in godliness. Okay, we have the ox, we have the donkey, we have the sheep, we have the slave, and the maid servant. Who is Yaakov Avinu actually referring to when he uses these 5 words? The ox, the donkey, the sheep, the slave, and the maid servant. I'm going to explain. Do not worry. Number 1, the shor, the ox, represents to Yosef Sadiq. The hamor represents to Issachar. The tzon represents the Jewish people. The slaves, the Jewish people, and the maid servant to the Jewish people. We'll explain each one accordingly. Yosef. The pasuk calls Yosef Bechor Shoro Hadar Lo. Bechor Shoro. Yosef was compared to the ox. And the question is, why? Short answer. Because Yosef, like Yaakov Avinu, that we're going to read in next week's Torah portion, usually Hanukkah, Shabbat Hanukkah, and Perashat Vayeshev, they always meet. So next Shabbat, we're going to be reviewing Perashat Vayeshev. And there the pasuk says, Elle Toledot Yaakov Yosef. These are the generations of Yaakov, Yosef. Rashi explains that the many situations that Yaakov Avinu experienced throughout his life, they were clone to Yosef. One of them in Egypt. Yosef in Egypt was no less challenging than Yaakov in the house of Lavan. I will tell you one thing. If you're asking me which one was more challenging, by far Yosef in Egypt, and not Yaakov in the house of Lavan. Although we cannot minimize the 20 years of hardship that Yaakov experienced in the house of Lavan. But you know what was the difference? That when Yaakov Avinu arrives to the house of Lavan, how old was Yaakov? 80 years almost. Yani, you come with 80 years of Torah learning. How old was Yosef when he was sold? 17. Can you compare 80 to 17? The nisyonot, the challenges, as a young man. Forget about as the son of Yaakov Avinu. As a young man, what kind of nisyonot he had to overcome in Egypt. But yet we all know, Baruch Hashem, the happy ending of the story, that Yosef survived. So Yaakov is telling Yosef, if you're going to get me, I have my bodyguards. Next, donkey. I remember that the word donkey, we used to heard it in the school. You went to the same school? Hamor. Right? Hamor Besurat Adam. That's, I think, went to the same kitab. The teachers used to call us, back then, today you're not allowed to do that. But back then, they used to call us, you're a donkey in the shape of a human. That's the meaning of that sentence. Telling the teacher was trying to encourage us to do better. And guess what? We listen and we accept it and we follow. Today, you call a child a hamor, you better call the therapy. Go to the therapist because you brought down the spirit of the child. But in a more serious note, who was the hamor of Yaakov Avinu? Issachar. Shevet Issachar. Issachar hamor got him. The donkey is connected to Issachar. Issachar, as we know, was who? The Torah learner from the sons of Yaakov. Issachar was the Kollel student. Zebulun, his brother, was the supporter of the Kollel, like many Baruch Hashem people do. How do you think the Kolelim survive? With the generosity of people. So Issachar, the donkey, is a type of animal that moves very slowly, number one. Number two, never complains. Number three, you're able to load him more than the rest of the animals. These three characteristics are essential for Avodat Hashem. Number one, spiritual growth needs to be done gradual. You don't go 0 to 60 in 15 seconds. That's too much. 0 to 60, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. That's how they sell cars, right? 0 to 60 in 3 seconds, right? More or less. But in Avodat Hashem, to go from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds is a recipe for disaster. You got to go gradual, one step at a time, one step at a time. And you will have hiccups because we all have them. But as long as we get up, we continue. Number one. Number two, Torah. Acquiring knowledge doesn't make the person heavier. In Spanish, they say, el saber no ocupa lugar. In English, it means knowledge does not take up space. A computer, a cell phone, if you don't clean it occasionally, or you don't clear your memory, or you delete files or pictures, the more you put in, the more one-way information comes in. Guess what? The slower the phone will work, and it will tell you is cannot save, storage reach capacity. So what do you need to do? You must delete files. You clear your memory, your X, you delete files, you clear your junk, so to speak, of mails or pictures that you no longer need, you get rid of them. That's how you clear the memory. But when it comes to the chokhmah of the person, the more we learn, not only the wiser we'll become and the more knowledgeable we'll become, but guess what? The more we learn, we realize how little do we know. So that's what Yaakov is telling Esav. He says, Esav, I have a great support system. I have a son by the name of Yosef. I have a son by the name of Issachar. Surviving adversity, Torah knowledge. Then I have three more, he says. I have the sheep, I have the slave, and I have the maid servant. These three words, if you look here at the English department, Jewish people, Jewish people, Jewish people. The Pasuk writes, Ba'anachnu abadecha beson mar'itecha. We are the sheep of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So if we are the sheep of God, so to speak, what position God occupies in our life? Hazaku Baruch, the shepherd. What David HaMelech says, chapter 24, Mizmor le David, Hashem ro'i, lo ihsar. God is my shepherd, lo ihsar. Hazaku Baruch. You remember who said that chapter? Besides David HaMelech, George W. Bush. After 9/11, he gave a speech and he started to quote from this verse of Tehillim. You are correct as well. In many Christian circles, they, of course, it's fine. They know the truth, you know. They, of course, they gravitate to the Bible and to the book of Tehillim, etc. So that pasuk already tells us we are Hashem's sheep. But then we have two different categories, slave and maid servant. David HaMelech says in the book of Tehillim, Hine ke'ene avadim el yad adonehem, ke'ene shifha el yad gevirtaha, ken einenu el Hashem Elokenu ad sheyachonenu. Sometimes we feel like avadim, like slaves in the hand of our master, or sometimes like maidservants in the hand of our master. Ken einenu el Hashem Elokenu. Let's say a person has a slave, right? Does the slave worries about you paying the light bill? No. The slave doesn't worry about nothing. As long as you provide what they need to do their job, they are happy. That's what the Pasuk says. They don't worry about your mortgage. They don't worry about your taxes. They don't worry about your insurance. They worry about nothing. Why? Because they're looking up to the master. The master must deal with it. That's what David HaMelech says in the book of Tehillim. We can be like slaves. We can be like maidservants. Ken'einenu el Hashem Elokenu. Our eyes are lifted to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is the message that Yaakov Avinu is telling Esav. He says, Esav, if your planning in our encounter is to get rid of me, you are going to fail. And we all know, Baruch Hashem, the happy ending of the story. Esav met, even though Esav attempted to do something to Yaakov, we know that Yaakov Avinu, Baruch Hashem, was able to survive and to flourish in life the way the next Parashiot will say. Yet, at the end of the Haftarah, yesterday, of this Shabbat's Haftarah, is very interesting. Many Pesukim discussing, Yaakov and Esav relationship. And then at the end, the Pasuk talks about that Mashiach's arrival. One Pasuk says, Ki karov Yom Hashem, the day of the Almighty is rapidly approaching. Al kol hagoyim, kasher asita yaseh lach gemulecha. The way they treated with us, they will be compensated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But then comes the Pasuk and it says, Be'aya bet Yaakov esh. The household of Yaakov is compared to a fire. Ubet Yosef lehaba. But the house of Yosef is compared to the flame. What's the difference between fire and flame? Basic difference. Fire is small. Flame is larger. Ubet Esav lekash. Straw or cash. Cash. How do you say in English? People burn cash. It's from today's Haftarah. The Pasuk says it, not me. Go to Obadiah Navi. He wrote it. That's what the Pasuk says. Esav is compared to the straw. What does it mean? The moment that the fire becomes in contact with the straw, in no time, the straw is decimated and disintegrated and burned down. Bedaleku bahem, and they will be ignited. Ba'achalum here means, yani they will be gone. Belo yesarit levet Esav. I will not have a remnant to Esav. Esav means the enemies of the Jewish people. And then the Pasuk says, Begaluta helazeh, this refers to the time of the Jewish people, at Sarfat, all the way to France, Begalut Yerushalayim, Asher Bisfarad, and the exile of Jerusalem that affects Spain. That's basically the Inquisition. If you think for a moment, what's the relationship? Spain and France are mentioned in the Haftarah. So if you think for a moment, two things happen in these two countries. Spain, the unfortunate Inquisition, known fact. France, what happened in France? Besides assimilation, and 10 Muslims per 1 Jew. That's how it's in France today. Okay? The French people are realizing this now, many years later. But you know what happened in France? The burning of the Talmud. The burning of carriages with Torah books. Yes, of course. That's where Rabbeinu Tam lived. That's where Rashi lived. Jewish blood was very cheap. And then the Pasuk says, בעלו מושיעים בהר ציון לשפוט את הר עשיו, והייתה להשם המלוכה. The famous pasuk that we read every day of our life is from today's Haftarah. The redemption of Am Israel, and that's how the Haftarah finishes. Vayeta Lashem Hamelucha, the kingdom will be restored. But I must say, I don't want to create any misunderstandings. Even though we gave a lot of attention to Esav, but remember what we learned a few weeks ago, that Esav and Ishmael, they joined forces. That's what the pasuk says. That Esav married the daughter of Ishmael. So even though in today's Haftarah we are paying a lot of attention and in the parasha to Esav, but remember that today the descendants of Esav and Ishmael are coming from the same source, based on the marital relationship that Esav married the daughter of Ishmael. What was the name of the daughter of Ishmael? Mahalat. Mahalat. What's the meaning of the word Mahalat? Illness. Mahalat bat Ishmael is a pasuk in the parasha. Chole. But, as the Gaon of Vilna said in the beginning, which I mentioned before in the first whiteboard, the antidote to Esav, the antidote of Ishmael, is in the voice of Yaakov Avinu alav shalom. With that being said, allow me, what time is it? Okay, good, early enough. Give me 5 minutes or less. The pasuk talks about the power of silence. That is the opening of the Zohar Kadosh. But the silence that the pasuk is referring to, it comes actually from a parasha Beshalach, when the pasuk says, Hashem ilachem lachem be'atem taharishum. In this English, in this pasuk means, God will wage the war on your behalf and you stay quiet. That is the pasuk. The background is that Moshe started to cry out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Hashem says to Moshe, Moshe, now is not the time to cry. Now is the time of action. What does it mean? Continue walking into the water. From this verse, our Hachamim teach us a lot of lessons. The Zohar gives us a lesson related to Shabbat, which I will discuss now. Very practical and easy lesson, Be'ezat Hashem, and hopefully can be implemented immediately from tonight. But also, our Hachamim tell us that one of the most powerful weapons for the Jewish people is what? Is staying quiet during the time of prayers. Meaning to say, pray and don't talk. Many people allow themselves to talk. And not all the time you're allowed to talk. God forbid, if there is an emergency, if Hatzalah, etc. It's one story. But as people, from Baruch She'amar till the end of the Amidah, we're not allowed to talk. Nothing, not even to say Hazak o Baruch, because it's not part of the prayer. Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo, you can answer depending on what part of the prayer are you. Once you cross Baruch She'amar, you cannot say Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo, you can only answer Amen. And Amen with limitations. Look at the chart of the prayer books at the end, and they give you yes, yes, no, no, yes. So if answering Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo or Amen, Yesh Amer Abba Mevarach, etc., in certain parts of the prayers, it's not allowed. Imagine talking in the middle of the tefillah. Although I must say that Baruch Hashem, we see an improvement in this area, and that's beautiful, but there is always room to grow. So our rabbis tell us that Be'atem Taharishun, in the merit of us during the moment of prayer and reading of the Sefer, because the Sefer Torah is not less important than the prayer. Actually, you're not allowed to leave the synagogue in the middle of the Sefer Torah. You're allowed to walk out of the synagogue. Let's say you're saying Hallelujah, Asher Yeshua Betecha, etc. You're allowed to walk out, get something from your locker. Not a problem. In the middle of the Sefer Torah, you're not allowed to walk out. You have to wait till the end of the Amidah, Mehillah, the end of the Aliyah. That's what I meant to say. Obviously, if you need to use the restroom and you cannot hold it, okay. But other than that, no. And that's one of the Pesukim. God will wage the war on our behalf on the merit of staying quiet during the moment of prayer. Powerful. There was a great rabbi, which we're not going to talk about him today. I'm just going to throw something on the table by the name of the Tosafot Yom Tov, the foremost commentator of the Mishnayot next to Rabino Batya of Aventura. If you look at the Mishnah, you have two explanations, Rabino Batya of Aventura and the Tosafot Yom Tov. You know what the Tosafot Yom Tov did? He established a prayer, a blessing for those that don't speak during Kaddish, Hazara, Tefillah, and Sefer Torah. I wish it's in the Sephardic prayer book. It's not. It's not. But it's in the Ashkenazic Siddur, right? I do it once a year. On the Shabbat of the Yortzeit of the Tosafot Yom Tov, when we do Petihat HaEchal, we make a Misheberach for those that don't speak during the prayer. It's a great zechut, because the more careful we are in this aspect, the more enhanced the sanctity of the synagogue is activated. There was a story. It's a strong story. Are you willing to listen to a strong story or not? It's not 9 o'clock at night. Should not give you nightmares. It's barely 10 o'clock in the morning. Short story. There was a fellow who approached the great Rabbi Avigdor Miller. I'm sure you remember him from Brooklyn. A holy man. Holy man. And he went to the rabbi, asked him for a blessing for an unfortunate medical condition that he developed. Unfortunate. And the first thing the rabbi asked him was, in the synagogue that you pray, he says, people talk during the prayers or not? The fellows, yes. He says, yeah. People talk. The rabbi says, find a different synagogue. He froze. He was shocked. I know, to us, it doesn't make sense. But that's why we're talking about him. He's not talking about us. Rabbi Avigdor Miller was a holy man. Even though he's gone many years from the physical world, but his words and Torah teachings resonates throughout the world. So the fellow wasn't happy with this answer. He says, what can I do, Rabbi? He says, go tell them in my name that if people will take upon themselves to be more respectful in the topic of sanctity of the synagogue, in the zechut of their silence, you will have a refuah shelema. It's not easy. I'll be the first one to say. It's not easy. How many times people come and speak to me during prayers? I want you to look at me when that happens. Hazaku Baruch, thank you for watching. What do I tell the person? After. Ba'aden. And use hand signals. That means later. Unless it's a medical matter. Last Shabbat, I had to come out in the middle of the prayer. You saw me coming out. Okay, you were in the holy city of Brooklyn. I can do nothing about it. Why did I get out? People ask me afterwards. There was a question in the mikveh that required the rabbi's attention on the spot. That's it. Other than that, we pray, we stay inside, and we follow the tefillah in the most beautiful way. Now, don't take it the wrong way. In this field, there is room to improve. We cannot fix the whole congregation. We cannot fix the entire community. It is true. I'll be the first one to say it's not easy. But you know what? If we start ourselves now, forget about the rest of the world. I start with myself. You start with yourself. You do what you can. You do what you can. Each and every one of us does something to enhance this level. We have the guarantee from the Torah. God will wage the wars on our behalf with one condition, that we stay quiet. That is the message of the Zohar of today. But the Zohar adds one more component. And you know what the Zohar Kadosh says? On what topics the person talks on Shabbat. Because both of them have to do with speech. And I'm not talking about the rabbi's speech. Talking about what kind of topic crowns our Shabbat table. Is the topics of goodness, sanctity, holiness, words of Torah, words of singing, or our Shabbat table suddenly becomes Friday night, because it's the big difference between Friday night and Shabbat night, even though they mean the same, right? But what's the difference? The Friday night becomes Friday night when the environment of the Shabbat is not there. It's not suitable for Shabbat. Doesn't matter investment, doesn't matter return, doesn't matter buying things. All those are wonderful topics, and we're not against people talking and socializing, etc. But like Shlomo HaMelech says, there is a time under the heaven for everything. During the synagogue, how long we spend in the synagogue to begin with? We're not in the time of the Gemara that we spend 9 hours a day at the synagogue, and you work 3 hours a day. That's how it was in the time of the Talmud. 3 hours per prayer, and time allowing 3 hours working, and that was a lot. Back then, they worked, they made what they needed for the day, and they went back to learn or to pray. That's how it was then. Obviously, we cannot compare. Living back then was much cheaper and much more affordable than today. I don't think people have to pay maintenance and assessments, right? And I agree. I'm not disagreeing. Okay? Forget about it. I mean, life change. Every generation, life changes. In every generation, it comes. But the Zohar Kadosh says, also on the Shabbat Kodesh, we want the Shabbat to be powerful. We want the Shabbat to be meaningful. Activate the reinforcement of this topic. Not only the dress, because everybody, I like to believe, or most of the people, they dress better in honor of Shabbat. Those who come to shul and live a Torah life, etc. Eating better on Shabbat, for sure. It's not even a question. We learned this in the Gemara on Sunday. That was the menu of the Sunday. But the talking requires enhancement, or I should say reinforcement, that we should deviate. Now, you may say, Rabbi, it's impossible to control people. I know that. What happens if you invite guests and suddenly they start talking on topics which are not conducive for the sanctity of the Shabbat? So it's not easy. And I'm not saying that is a foolproof suggestion, but perhaps in a respectful way, you can say, you know what, all that is wonderful, and I respect everything that you are saying, but let's keep it on the Shabbat mode. Because sometimes this type of conversations, they may start in a friendly manner, and then you have disagreements, and you have different opinions, and then a word here, a word there, and then can escalate into forgetting the only thing about Shabbat on the table is the candles that are suffering, because God forbid, I'm not saying this, it's written in the holy books. Remember last week's class when the Malachim come to the home, when we gave the shiur on Shalom Aleichem? And what did we discuss? The Malachim check the candles, the garments, and the table. All that is included in the table. So we want to make sure that our guests are comfortable. So one of the ways that we do that is through the way the Zohar Kadosh of today says. I'm not telling you to stay quiet. And if you have nothing to say on your Shabbat table, guess what? You can repeat anything you heard in the class. You can buy a book and you read a weekly message on the Perashah, if it's Living Emunah or Daily Dose of Bitachon or whatever book of Torah. You open up a short chapter, a short story, and guess what? You enhance slowly your Shabbat table. And like he said very eloquently in one word, sing. Sing. Now you say, Rabbi, I have no voice. You think I have a voice? I have, okay. God gave me a voice. You also have a voice. You're not going to break the glass or the crystal or the window. That's true. But do your best. That's the idea is. The idea is that the Shabbat, it's something special, not just Friday night dinner. Because that brings hashpa'ah, that brings an influence on the life of the person. And if we're talking about a young couple, the children are on the table, the benefits are even greater, or the detriment, it's even greater. My good friends, I'd like to wish everybody a beautiful Shabbat wherever you are. Thank you. And Be'ezat Hashem, we'll see each other Shabbat. For those who are not here on Shabbat, we'll see each other Be'ezat Hashem Sunday morning. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen. Rabbi Hananiah ben Akashia.